According to new battlefield data, Russia is advancing at the fastest pace it has in the last 2 years of the war. But that doesn't seem to deter the Ukraine side because they keep saying they're going to win anyway. Hard to really reconcile those two things here, but that kind of shows you really where the heads are of a lot of people on the Ukraine side. But then even on the Western side, we also have continued detachment from reality, where it's not enough that we have to try to figure out the Russia-Ukraine war, but we're trying to draw in Russia and China all in one big glob of a boogeyman enemy to justify spending a whole bunch more money on national defense. And all this is doing is keeping the flames of war alive. It's feeding the flames of the current conflict and setting the conditions for what could be a future conflict, which is insane and something we should avoid at all cost. And to try to help us make sense of this all this different chaos flowing around here, we have one of our popular guests, Patrick Henningsen. He's the host of I think the Sunday Wire. That's what we're calling it right now, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The Sunday Wire. Yeah, thanks. So that's welcome back to the show, Patrick. We always love having you on.
It's great to be with you, Danny.
And I also forgot to mention you have that Substack there, so definitely want to point folks to that so you can keep up with Patrick even when he's not on our show. Let's just jump right into this. According to The Economist, the Russians have been advancing at a pace that's faster. Well, no, I'm sorry. I actually don't want to start with that. The Ukraine side is saying that they have a plan to win this war no matter what, even if without the United States. And yeah, that's the one there. And this is in the Telegraph here. According to this article, a fellow named Andrei Zagorbanuk and Alina Frolova, sorry for butchering those names probably, two former Ukrainian defense ministers who run the Center for Defense Strategies in Ukraine, have spent the past weeks lobbying Western officials to pursue what they call strategic neutralization. What it means is that the Russians can keep fighting for as long as they want to, but without being able to make any progress. A redefinition of victory, their words, not mine, is Ukraine surviving and functioning regardless of how long the war lasts. Russia's, quote, functional defeat, another term Frolova and her co-author have coined, would allow Ukraine to begin its economic recovery, bring home refugees, and attract investment in the West, all while the war continues, albeit in a neutered style. I mean, let's just talk about just the fundamentals and just the factors there. Let's take the last part there at the beginning, is that they're saying, yeah, we'll have a, quote, functional defeat, which will define that Russia can keep fighting, but we're going to bring home all the refugees, attract foreign investment from the West. Now, who in the world from the Ukraine side, let's start there, Patrick, is going to come back with the war continuing to go on because these two say it's a cool idea?
I thought our analysts in think tank land were a little bit detached from reality. I mean, this is another level here. That's like really intense kind of coping language coming out of the Ukrainian side. Why? What's the object of this? The object is to find a way to justify the extending the status quo, which is this, war that can go on in perpetuity, but it can only go on in perpetuity for certain parties. Certainly, there is a class within Ukraine that are doing very well. It's keeping them in power for starters. Secondly, it's very profitable if you happen to be at the front of the queue for Western aid and cash, and you manage to game the system in Kiev and Lviv. But for the Western sponsors and benefactors, they also want to keep this going in perpetuity because it's been so good for business, because it sort of fits this forever political narrative that we must defend Ukraine and must not allow Russia to win. So it works for them. And quite frankly, I don't think it makes a difference for Russia because they have their strategies, they have their objectives. They're going to dig in as long as it takes. And if they get any positive signals from the other side, they're ready to negotiate, as they said. Ready to draw a line under wherever that may be, but if not, they will just move forward, and they have the advantage militarily and strategic depth, resources, and so forth. Who's the one in the middle, though, that's losing in this? And it's going to be the Ukrainian people. It's going to be the Ukrainian population. So that's a finite pool of resource for fighting this war. That's a finite pool. And politically, it has a timeline on it. The clock is ticking. There's resistance, there's resentment. All these things are getting worse and worse by the day throughout what's left of Ukraine, the territories under the control of Kiev. And so that's going to just become a constant problem that's just going to get worse and worse. So you can see where the disparity is in terms of the narratives. And it seems like politically for Europe, and what's good for Europe is probably good enough for America. They need this conflict to carry on for at least 5 more years in order to.
That is just insane. But you see that there seems to be, I don't know if collusion is the right word, but common purposes with that comment or with that sound or the call out that we had there a second ago, because one of their objectives of this group, which definitely has the support of the Kiev government, is that they want to continue to attract investment from the West. And as you said, that there's too many in the West that are eager to do that, which, I mean, there's no rational path to preventing a Russian military victory, much less even contemplating the fantasy of ever winning. But there's not even that. And yet the objective seems to be on both sides of the line here. Well, not both sides of the line. Both sides of the Ukraine and the Western sides are saying, yeah, let's just keep this thing rolling on so we can keep the cash coming in. That doesn't seem like a good thing for the people in the middle that you just described.
But what's also delusional on the Western side and the European side is they're constantly underestimating the capability, the military will of the Russian Federation. I'll give you an example. They have, in terms of direct investment, they have put factories on the ground in Ukraine, owned and operated by European defense contractors, and they're dotted all in different places, producing different things. One of them was recently, I believe, hit. It was a Polish facility owned by a Polish defense conglomerate. And, so Russia can, as soon as they have the intelligence of the location of any of these places, you can see right now there's going to be no hesitation. It doesn't matter who owns it. So this is probably the worst place to do direct investment. And I can't see how they could get insurance for any of these businesses under these conditions. This is not an investment-friendly environment. But they've been deluded because they think that Russia's believing their own propaganda, that Russia's on their back heels. They're running out of men. They're running out of ammo. Trump believes they've lost 1 million men.
You say they believe that, but do they really believe that, or are they just saying it because that keeps the money flowing?
Maybe a bit of both. I'm sure there's a layer of people that know closer to reality, a cynical layer underneath the public-facing figures that we see, like the Kallis, von der Leyen, and the heads of state like Merz and so forth. Politically, they have to maintain a certain party line on what is the status of the conflict there. But there are people, I'm sure, that know. But I think what a way to waste money to build a factory producing arms or anything in Ukraine like this to do with the war. It's just already got a target painted on it the minute they put the stakes down. So I can't see that. There's a lot of plans to that end. And BlackRock has recently announced that they're pulling out of the so-called reconstruction initiative for Ukraine because they realized all the high-performing assets are in the eastern side under Russian control, and Russia's going to be rebuilding anything that Russia passes over. It's going to fall under Russian reconstruction. So now BlackRock is pulled out. You need to pull some different gambits to try to get people to keep them interested in Ukraine, that there's some kind of future here. It's just insane if you think about it, that you can sort of drum up an economy and investment in the midst of this apocalyptic situation in the country. It's quite extraordinary.
And to facilitate that, you had Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday tried to put on this presentation of normalcy, and that he hosted or spoke before a parliament meeting where he, in part, introduced the new prime minister.
I express gratitude to Yulia Sviridenko for her effective work on programs that support Ukrainian production. Her experience in strengthening our national resilience and advancing Ukraine's economic growth must be continued and scaled as a key task of the Ukrainian government. I count on the government's program of action being presented as soon as possible and implemented in a daily format. Each day must deliver results for Ukraine. Ukraine's defense and security forces will continue to receive all necessary resources to protect our nation and defend our people. We will intensify our negotiation efforts for a just resolution of the war and for guaranteeing real security for Ukraine.
So you have all these thunderous applause there. Yeah, because you're going to continue to give us everything we need to continue fighting this war so that we can get a just and lasting peace, which I'm sure he got directly from Keir Starmer, who loves to use that phrase. But can there be anything more detached from reality, especially in light of the headline of this topic here, is that Russia has advanced faster right now than it has in the last 2 years, i.e. the war is losing faster.
Yeah, interesting choice of a prime minister. But you have to remember, Zelensky just extended his, state of emergency authoritarian mandate another 3 months, and then that will be renewed for a following subsequent 3 months after that. It's interesting, the timeline of that somewhat overlaps with Donald Trump's 50-day ultimatum that he's given the Russians. We need to make a deal in 50 days or I'm going to get very angry and something is going to happen. So that's an interesting, because the last time Trump issued an ultimatum was with the Iranians, 60 days. And what happened on the 61st day? They were in the midst of last-minute negotiations and there was a sneak attack. Okay, so what do you think they have planned for this 50 days? I would bet the smart money on some kind of an Operation Spider's Web 2.0, some kind of glorious, gallant raid by those feisty Ukrainians, and then turn to the West and Lindsey Graham and everybody in the news say, look, they've still got fight in them. They've still got fight in them. More money, more weapons, keep this thing going. And this seems to be the cycle for the last couple of years now, at least for the last 18 months. It's been highlighted by these gallant raids, or these, ballsy moves by the Ukrainians to, strike deeper into Russian territory. It always seems to coincide with something, either some kind of negotiations that are being attempted, some kind of summit, or some sort of statement. In Trump's case, he can just lay out these ultimatums on Truth Social, and somehow, something needs to happen by then. Russia's not taking any notice of it. But meanwhile, in Ukraine, they're announcing that they're considering conscripting women. Okay, so if you think about this is a level of desperation right now. We could be, and I don't want to sound overly overly optimistic, but we could be reaching some of the final moves on the Ukrainian side, because Russia's ramped up their operation. They're moving into another phase, which is featuring a lot more in the air, and that's definitely their forte. And if that continues to move in that direction, you could see things get very, very bad for Ukraine very quickly, to the point where you're already seeing these kind of mea culpas in the Western press, which I never thought I would see, like, Ukrainian casualties and Ukrainian war crimes. The New York Times just did a story on documenting Ukrainian war crimes against Russian POWs and civilians. That was like verboten a year ago, not allowed. That kind of that would have hurt the quote war effort, that kind of coverage. So are we seeing the ground being laid for something here? That's a question worth asking.
And you mentioned about the conscription issue, and I just showed you that video from yesterday where, they had the raucous applause. Well, everybody in the parliament wasn't happy yesterday, as this one parliamentarian made it very clear.
Ти посмотрите, що робиться. Вони вже слова навіть не дають. Які речі здійснювати? Які речі? Я хочу виступати і говорити по своїй правці.
And one of the things he was upset about was Zelensky had this kind of caustic and casual dismissal of any move to demobilize, because there's this issue that some of these guys have been mobilized for the whole period of the war, so 3.5 years, and they're just psychologically and physically exhausted. and a lot of them want to come home. What a shock. And Zelensky said, yeah, nobody's coming home until we've defeated Russia. So, pound sand, basically. This guy wasn't talking about that. He was also complaining about a lot of not conscription, but when people were stealing money. And he says, I'm not going to be silent about this. And some of the other opposition figures in the Ukrainian parliament were saying maybe we should even have an impeachment because of all this corruption, et cetera. Now, that's kind of on the low side. And you said you saw the majority were all clapping instead, but do you see that as a potential crack in the facade as well?
Well, that parliamentarian is not just any parliamentarian. That is one of the ringleaders of the Odessa massacre at the trade unions building in May of 2014, a really seminal event in terms of the sort of far-right violence, if you will, against ethnic Russians. And it's one of the things that really fomented the civil war that broke out in 2014, because that's exactly what happened in 2014. So, and he's also photographed with Nancy Pelosi. He was there with Mike Pompeo when he was in Ukraine recently. So to see him upset at the Zelensky regime, if that indeed was the case, or not happy with how the things are going, that's quite interesting because that's one of the real extreme radicals, extreme far-right radicals. And so aligned with neo-Nazi factions and so forth. So, what's interesting, I saw an article with Jacques Spaud, who's a Swiss NATO intelligence, retired or former NATO intelligence, and he said recently, I forgot which broadcast it was on, but he's someone who called this chapter and verse, by the way, from day one in 2022. And so he said that his reports and his intelligence and the interviews that he's done on the subject for his own work and his books and so forth, there's a resistance building inside Ukraine. So you have a bizarre situation, even in Kiev and some of these areas. You have the far-right resistance against the Zelensky. And then you have the pro-Russian resistance or the anti-war resistance in Ukraine allying with that far right who both want Zelensky out. They want to bring the war to an end. This is a real thing. So this has been sort of drip feeding for a while now. And these types of trends, if you look at, insurgencies and things like that, when you study these types of situations, they only increase over time. So what you might have is if they can carry this proxy war down the road a little bit further, this is also going to build up resistance in the country, armed resistance. This is a problem for the police forces and law enforcement in Ukraine right now. It's a worry, and it could become more than that if, for instance, some of these start getting Russian backing. And I'm talking about weapons and things like that. Then you're into a totally new situation. That you have to remember, that was the fear that Russia had, one of their main fears about moving westward in Ukraine, taking territories, that they would encounter a fierce insurgency in areas that they would then occupy. And that was a big problem. And certainly that might have been the case early on in the conflict. That's when you had NLAWs and some of these other types of shoulder-mounted munitions becoming a real problem for the way that they were managing the conflict early on. So think about this, if it goes into that phase, think about a place like Odessa that's nominally Russia. It's nominally Russian. It's historically Novorossiya. If you have a armed resistance faction in the place like that, it's also possible that it could be weakened, or the Kiev's hold over that oblast could be weakened from the inside. Then it's a totally different story at that point when you're talking about what Russia may or may not do.
It truly is. And actually, Colonel Bo's been on our show quite a number of times, and probably 2 or 3 months ago, he made a similar comment about an insurgency on the Ukraine side of the line of contact. And he said that had been growing, and I've heard, I think he was on Glenn Deason recently talking some updates. We're hoping to have him back on to go into some detail on that here in the near future as well. And then there's also, I've heard from separate sources that there is an increasing number of Russian special forces, of sometimes Spetsnaz or FSB guys. I'm not sure which it is, but apparently there's a number of Russians already there that are helping both with targeting and with supplying some of these sabotage groups that are apparently scattered throughout Ukraine. So I think that is going to play an increasing part. But that's just weakening the fabric further behind the line of contact. But as we're going to see in this following part here, that's happening on the front line as well. And now the front line is moving faster. Gary, if you can put that second headline up there from The Economist, is reporting that our data suggests that at its current pace of advance, the Russians are moving at the fastest in 2 years. They say, albeit from a low baseline, they have to try to make it sound not as bad as it could be. But in this war of 3.5 years, they are moving faster now than they have in the last 2 years. In recent weeks, Ukraine has endured some of the heaviest drone and missile bombardments of the conflict. And I want to show you that there's actually some really interesting graphics on this article here. And let me pull that up. So this is the actual article here. And what they have, just so you know what you're seeing on this map here, is that they're using NASA data for fire anomalies, and they were able to combine that with other information and knowledge they have to be able to say, like some of these gray spots in the middle, that's just where a fire happened, but it had nothing to do with the war. The red spots is where there are fire anomalies that have to do with attacks. And so that's part of what they're using to base this off of. And then they're saying, look, let's take a look at some of the areas. So down here in the Kherson area, all of these on the southern part of the line, this is from Ukraine strikes, whether drone or artillery, on the Russian controlled part, and then all the ones on the northern side are the Russians against the Ukraine side. And they say heavy fire across the Dnieper River in the Kherson region. Much of this is caused by Russian drone strikes on farmland rather than a serious attempt to advance. Russian rumored amphibious offensive has yet to happen. That's talking about in the Odessa area. That has been rumored a lot, and that apparently is still on the table. But these strikes, especially here in some of these areas in this part of the Zaporizhia front, there's been a lot of action here, and actually Russia's been making some, the Russian side has been making some progress on that side of the front. And these are basically in preparation for more ground offensives here. And then we roll up here up into the Sumy region, where it says 50,000 strong force has been attacking in the Sumy region. They say that our model detecting artillery fire and explosions, Ukraine is badly outnumbered, but they are holding the front. From other reporting that I get, however, is that the Russians are just holding these guys in place here, and they have stopped trying to advance forward into Sumy, because they have actually taken some of the troops out to move them elsewhere on the eastern front, but they left enough here to hold the front so that the Ukraine side can't also withdraw some of its forces. But then you get into the areas where a lot has been happening. In the Seversk area, tactical waypoints en route to remaining Ukraine strongholds in the Donbass. So Russia's been attacking here and try to complete the area of the Donbass and take that. But then probably the most important one of all is Russia's main effort is further south. Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, two important logistical hubs, are being pummeled by the full weight of Vladimir Putin's army. Whether they hold could determine the entire fate of the Eastern Front. And that completely corresponds to an interview we had with a Russian journalist who was a former Russian soldier, who said for sure that the Pokrovsk area is the main effort for the Russian side. And they feel if they can break through that area there, they feel like they can use exploitation forces to penetrate and go further into the Ukraine, which could literally cause the entire Eastern Front to buckle. And it could literally be rolled up from the middle in the north and in the south direction, presuming Russia has the forces for that. That was reinforced also. That's kind of the big picture. Alex of History Legends, one of our go-to sources here on our analysis of what's happening on the ground, really put this in sharp detail in a video out just this morning.
In the past few weeks, the Russian army managed to break through in between two very strategic cities for Ukraine, Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. How did the Russians do it? Our friends from the Kyiv Post wrote, "Momentum is slipping. Russia's summer offensive is losing steam." What? Let's fact check this real quick by looking at the map. This was the frontline situation in mid-April between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, where we last left off. And this is the situation now, 3 months later. The Russians were aura farming like crazy with this offensive. Plus 12 kilometers in this direction, plus 12 kilometers northwards, and plus 20 kilometers to the west. And let's cut the BS. If the Russians capture Radinsky, Pokrovsk will be in an operational encirclement.
And that is continuing on. I checked the update this morning on Military Summary Channel, and Russia is now within 3 kilometers of Radinsky. So they're already within easy. I mean, they're within mortar range, much less artillery and drone range. So they already have that under fire. And more evidence that they're up north and closing in under Radinsky. So that could literally fall within a week. And once that happens, then Pokrovsk is in an operational encirclement. So everywhere you look on the battlefield, and I mean everywhere, things are going poor for the Ukraine side. And yet, as you saw in the beginning, they're continuing to hold out for some kind of a redefined victory.
It's just the opposite of the noise you're hearing coming out of Europe and the sort of confidence that's being espoused by Western leaders in the NATO member states. They believe that Europeans flat out believe the way they're talking is that Ukraine can hold the line without American support theoretically, and so and Europe will be picking up some of the responsibility of if America's shirking or receding in its duties of backing Ukraine. So they believe that the U.S. can sell weapons. There's a mechanism for payment now with NATO. Trump's happy with this transactional portal. And by the way, it's so funny because you had this, flash of almost high IQ brilliance by Kalia Kallas, the permanent representative, second in command at the European Union. She remarked that, well, the United States says it's helping Ukraine, but we're the ones who are paying for the weapons. Them supplying weapons isn't really supporting Ukraine. We're paying for it. Therefore, we are the ones who are supporting Ukraine. It's very close to actually truth. So I was impressed that she was able to muster that kind of courage to kind of make a sidewinding remark at the United States. That's interesting. But they really believe that Ukraine can hold the line and that they're holding the line. And so this is where the reporting and the propaganda becomes chronic and fatal for the West, because they've been able to limp along and hobble along with this idea that everything that we talked about on this show and other shows, that this delusion that Ukraine's just on the cusp of victory and Russia's on the cusp of defeat, and all they need is the next round of wonder weapons. And they really believe those wonder weapons are coming. The British are absolutely committed to this new kind of Operation Spider's Web, drone swarms, things like this. They really believe that this is going to be, as they say in the West, as they say at the Naval War College in Monterey or in Washington, D.C., a revolution in military affairs is about to begin. And there have been many RMAs throughout this conflict in a certain way. Certainly with drone technology, that's the case. But these are tactical RMAs. They're not necessarily going to...
Well, see, and I argue it's not a revolution in military, it's an evolution. I think is probably a better way to put it.
An EMA.
Yeah. Doesn't sound as good, so they don't use it, but that
would make a good PhD paper, Danny, if you want to go back and get your next qualification. You can upgrade that, because they've been banding that term around for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a problem. Ukraine's running out of men, and there might be a point where they're going to run out of ammo as well, because that's not an infinite, unlimited supply either. And the United States is stretched. I don't see the production capacity for Europe in terms of ammunition that impressive. Serbia announced they're halting exports of, and that's one of Europe's biggest ammunition manufacturers is Serbia, and they have been supplying ammunition that's not directly to Ukraine, but then is brought to Ukraine via third parties. And they've even hit the brakes and put a moratorium on the export of ammunition recently. I don't know if that's still in play or not, but that was about 3 weeks ago. So something's going on here. You could see a crunch at a time where, as you've shown, Danny, Russia is in the ascendancy again in this conflict, and that again is bad news for Ukraine, bad news for those backing it.
And and this the whole pace of keeping the fiction going. is taking on a really an increased fervency, I'll say, at the top of the West. And what I think may be going on is that there are those who recognize that crunch you're talking about could come, and that could be a really inconvenient thing if the Ukraine side, if their military collapsed, because then that would put an end to some of this. Or would it? Because I think now then they're trying to stretch the canvas at NATO to say, hey, this is actually something of future Russian aggression and Chinese aggression. And we showed a couple of days ago where Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, was saying, hey, look, we have to get ready and we have to build up our forces because China is growing up and they're getting ready to take Taiwan. And he's going to pick up the phone. He's going to call Vladimir Putin and have him attack us once they're ready to do that. And look, this could be in 3 to 5 to 7 years. This is coming quick and we got to move. That's what he said earlier in the week. And then I believe this was just yesterday, you had the new Supreme Allied Commander, General Grinkowicz, an American Air Force general, backed him up.
The simultaneity of conflict, right? This is the idea that a war in Europe could happen at the same time as a war in the Pacific. And those of you who listen to our great Secretary General Mark Rutte have heard him say that, you know, the thing Xi's probably going to do before he decides to go across the Taiwan Strait is give his friend Putin a call and ask him to help. That to me means that both of these things could happen together. We're going to need every bit of kit and equipment and munitions that we can in order to meet that. And we've all heard the year 2027. That's just 2 years away when we think that Xi could be ready to make his move and that phone call to Putin might come.
So 2027, that's just right around the corner. So apparently there's just huge war and we got to hurry up and get ready for it. What do you make of all that?
I want to sort of defer to his better expertise because he's certainly more qualified than me. But the idea that China would need Putin to come to their rescue to do whatever they want to do in Taiwan, I just find that to be preposterous, seeing that China is a country of 1.2 billion and they have a substantial military and arsenal. They have more weapons than they know what to do with right now, China. So in terms of Taiwan, the likelihood is if that ever comes to a head, it's going to more likely finish without firing a shot, because the Chinese don't regard the Taiwanese as foreign people; they regard them as Chinese, and vice versa. So, but the American rhetoric on this, it's almost like it feels like if they start really ramping up the Chinese rhetoric, that's another signal that Ukraine is becoming a lost cause. So, I mean, I can't see how you can connect those two things. And by the way, what does the U.S. have to gain or lose by Taiwan being closer to China or not, other than it may lose its military, the raison d'etre for its own military footprint in the Pacific? So, I mean, isn't that what we're talking about? It's not about defending the democratic rights of the poor Taiwanese. So again, and these political questions take on a lot more significance as the U.S. becomes more stretched, as the political system comes under stress, as people say, wait a minute, do we really want to be fighting a 3 and 4 front war right now? Why are we fighting a 3 and 4 front war? Is this actually productive, or is this really just about Andorral and the new military industrial complex going into hyperdrive in terms of, you know, share prices and profits and so forth? It's kind of a strange time right now, because I have not seen anybody in the Trump administration or attached to it talking about that what I think is the most diplomatic way out of a lot of these conflicts, which is negotiations, which is diplomacy. That's the most economic. It's
right. And of course, Trump's apparently his definition of diplomacy is telling Putin what to do. And if he doesn't do it, well, then we have bigger problems. We have to start arming people. So there's no genuine diplomacy that's going on at all. I want to talk a little bit about one of the things we love to do on the show is to show multiple sides of the situation here. So we don't want to just show you what the Western / NATO / US side is talking about in this, you know, this conglomeration of Russia and China, but we also want to see what the Russian side is saying. And actually, I wanted to put this up there because one of the Let's see. Yeah, one of our viewers here earlier in the show said that he has this interview with Konstantin Roshkov, channel Real Reporter. As it turns out, we're going to actually show you something he said, because he just had yesterday, he posted a video with a former Russian officer who's extremely well connected with the Kremlin. And he asked him the question about this whole thing about what NATO is talking about with China and Russia coming together. And that's why they have to jump up to 5% spending and GDP and everything. And he said, is Russia really going to go after the Western Europe?
Leading up to the summit, there was a whole wave of articles laying out various scenarios for a possible Russian attack on Europe, published in major outlets like the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and several others. Western politicians joined in too, making loud and confident statements. For example, the German defense minister went into great detail, explaining how exactly Russia would supposedly launch an attack on Europe, how it would play out, and even claimed that the deadline could come as early as 2027 or maybe in 2029. The very first thing any military strategist has to do is define the objective. And that's exactly the problem when we look at these claims about Russia supposedly planning to invade the Baltics. Whenever I try to figure out what Russia's actual goal in such a scenario would be, I just throw up my hands. I honestly can't think of any logical objective. It makes no sense at all. Some people say, oh, the Russians want to test whether NATO's Article 5 would actually work. In other words, they're supposedly curious whether the Americans would respond with nuclear weapons if Russia launched an attack on the Baltic countries. So, according to this theory, Russian generals might start some bizarre experiment to test NATO's solidarity. It's like kids poking a sleeping bear with a stick. Hey, what happens if we poke it? Let's try. But honestly, that just sounds childish to me. That's why I see all this talk for what it really is. Propaganda aimed at convincing everyone that they have to spend 5% of GDP on defense.
I mean, I come to the same conclusion that what possible motivation would Russia have to want to conquer Western lands and potentially trigger an Article 5? And yet that kind of analysis is never even done on the Western side, or at least it's never talked about, which makes me think, and this is what I'm asking you, that this truly is just, no, let's keep the threat of war up there so that we can keep the gravy train rolling. I mean, it seems pretty crass, but I mean, it's pretty plausible based on the evidence we have.
Well, the other danger here, Danny, is that there are people in leadership positions, including Mark Rutte. I've not heard him. You know, this is the problem with having no functional media, okay? That a good journalist would be able to, at a press conference, pin Mark Rutte down and say, where do you stand on Article 5? Suppose you launch, you help Ukraine, you assist them, you give them the weapons to hit Moscow, and then Russia then retaliates at the source of those weapons in European factories in Germany or whatever. Where would you stand on that? Would you consider that an Article 5 violation, or do you take responsibility for making that situation happen? Like that's what would really help, but we don't have that, and so Article 5 is not. It's not a dead hand automatic trigger. First you have Article 4 and you go into consultation, and then the member states will decide whether they want to participate. And this isn't talked about, but the problem is most politicians, when you say Article 5, it's like this whip reflex, and we're into war, and they use this as that is the basis for this proxy war. That is the leverage, that is the implied threat from NATO, and that's what's backing their support for Ukraine and allowing them to get away with playing fast and loose with how you're defining this conflict, whether they're co-belligerents or not. It's all based on the Article 5 trap, okay? But that's not how it's designed. That's not how NATO is written. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. And what would happen in that situation? Because that seems to me the only way Russia would attack on the Western side is if they were attacked and they believed that the source of that attack came from a NATO member state, and they felt that's it, we've got to put our foot down. What would Europe do in that case? Would they go all out, or would they panic? I think there would be a political panic. And the fear of God would go through some of these Baltic states and governments and Scandinavian countries that seem to be talking tough under the banner of the collective force of NATO, with the United States standing behind, carrying the big stick. But when it really comes to it, they then have to be responsible about how they got to that position. Perfect example. Right now, you'll see the worst things get in Ukraine. You're going to see people pivoting, talking about the Arctic. Oh, we need to arm the Arctic. We need to increase our, Russia and China are basically taking over the Arctic Northwest Passage. And that's where people are going to want to safely redirect their resources. Yeah, because and so they believe that Russia is somehow, now that Finland is a NATO country, they need to basically arm up the border region between Finland and Russia because they think that there's a potential for a Russian invasion in Finland. And if the reality is, why would Russia want to invade the most desolate part of Europe anyway? They don't need to. If they see a threat in 2025. If there's a threat emanating from Sweden or Finland, for Russia, it's a case of firing, Kinzhals and Oresniks and eliminating the industrial capacity of those countries, because that's what they will do. They're not going to expend any manpower at all in this, but they're putting all their money and resources on arming up and militarizing that whole region along the Arctic rim. And because they believe that this is a new front, basically. And again, you're right, Danny. It's a sinkhole for money first and foremost. But haven't we already gone through these drills during the Cold War? I mean, those were still contentious areas. Although Finland and Sweden were neutral, now they're members of NATO. The West believed that, well, no, we need to really back them. And Sweden's got to raise its conscription level for men to the age of 70. I'm not joking. That's what they're proposing this week, because they say that all the experienced officers need to have the ability to be welcome into the conscription. So welcome. So 70 it could be that could be the new ceiling for conscription in Sweden. So they're already kind of getting into that war mode. Whether they're prepared or able, or if there's going to be any kind of meaningful conflict between these two countries, that's another story.
Well, let's certainly hope not. One other thing I wanted to talk about before we let you go, this is from the the diplomatic perspective. So we've been talking about the military so far, but primarily there's also a diplomatic engagement going on from the Russian side. Now, we've talked about how Mark Rutte has been talking about, China and Russia, and oh my gosh, and many others have said, look at this actual axis of evil is real. There really is Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. They really are coming against us, and we need to be alarmed about this. Forget about the fact that it's been our actions that have shoved them together. But for the moment, let's leave that aside. But Sergei Lavrov, I think it was yesterday, said, or a couple of days ago, he said, there's another grouping of states that are arrayed against another we might want to also consider.
The Indo-Pacific strategies symbolize NATO countries' desire to expand their infrastructure into the Far East, the Southeast Asia region, Northeast Asia, and to establish alliances there with a nuclear dimension, such as AUKUS, the US, the UK, Australia, the Trilateral, the US, South Korea, and Japan, which are conducting increasingly large-scale exercises, also with a nuclear component, among many others. The US-backed Indo-Pacific Quad includes New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. All of this is accompanied by the eastward expansion of NATO infrastructure, including in dangerous forms such as the transfer of ground-based intermediate and shorter-range missiles to the Philippines.
So Lavrov saying, look, you want to talk about an alliance forming against you? How about the one forming against us in China? And he'd list, whether it's AUKUS, it's some of the trilat stuff that we have with Japan and South Korea, et cetera, on a number of things. And so when you look at it, you're going, well, yeah, but those are defensive. That shouldn't spur any kind of actions from the Russian side. They're wrong for getting together, but we're cool for it. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, they've been trying to expand NATO, and they had a consultation group with Japan. Britain was front running this effort a couple of years ago. The short-lived Prime Minister Liz Truss, I believe, did a stint there as foreign secretary, whatever. She was deployed, and the AUKUS thing has turned out to be a complete debacle, by the way. It caused a major rift between the French and the British, because France had a deal which then pulled out from under them by the
Oh, that's
Americans
right.
and the
Yeah, I
British
forgot about that.
on the submarines, but they're not going to be delivered. The whole deal is collapsing because they're not going to be able to fulfill it, not on any meaningful time scale. And plus the cost overruns are supposed to be like astronomical. So what is this going, what sort of level of deterrent? Certainly on paper, yes, they're surrounding China, no doubt about that. And that's been going on for 30 years, okay? But in terms of how you can make that work in terms of justifying an alliance like NATO that far eastward, again, it's always the power is predicated on the Article 5, and so that's a kind of a flimsy mission, if you will, for your collective force can be triggered if one party is attacked or something like that. So they need to sign up somebody in NATO to in the East, in Asia, be it South Korea or be it God forbid, Taiwan. Japan, perhaps. I just can't see the Japanese, the South Koreans, definitely not the Taiwanese going for that. So what is going on here? Is this really just more, they're trying different things to try to push the line eastward in terms of militarization, and there's going to be a cost associated with all of this. There's going to be money, business associated with all of this. So I would be very cynical and say I think there's huge profits to be made by refitting the entire Pacific Fleet and all of these other projects and new positions and bases, nuclear submarines. So, that's probably one of the biggest in terms of, money, revenue, profits is going to be the Pacific, is rebuilding out the Pacific. So those are big ticket items right across there. If you look at how
in
long we've been
kind of gravy trains.
The DMZ in Korea, Okinawa, Guam, and all of our other in the archipelagos. I mean, it's kind of endless if you think about it. So it's maybe even more than what we'd be spending in Europe. So I don't know. I just can't see it working, but it has to happen. The United States has to confront China. They have to try to encircle China, contain China. But what it's really about, I think, is disrupting China and disrupting Asia and disrupting the Belt and Road Initiative more than anything, and kind of sabotaging that effort. And that's the rewiring of trade and commerce on the Eurasian landmass. That's what that is, and that includes Iran, Pakistan, and the Middle East, the New Silk Road, Azerbaijan, and everything in between. So you got to step back and look at this. Not just about military skirmishes between Taiwan and China, but look at it geopolitically, as Brzezinski does in the grand chessboard, and as the British did before him, and all the geopolitical thinkers like Mackinder and Spikeman, and these sort of global thinkers. That's the way they looked at it. That formed long-term, long-range British and American strategy for the last 150 years. So we're in the same place, really.
But if I can just say there, even if I might not have agreed with some of the things they were doing back then, they were some genuinely good strategic thinkers. I don't think we have that anymore. I think we're trying to play that game, but we have guys whose knowledge is about an inch deep, and they're just trying to play like little kids wearing their daddy's clothes or something like that. I don't think it's going to end well.
The big difference, Danny, between today and back then, you're right about the great minds before, but China's going to put a man on the moon probably in 3 years. That's the difference. Is the development of Asia. So all of that, all those geopolitical plans and strategies about global domination, they haven't been updated to factor in the rise of Asia. Yeah. And the only solution coming from Washington is, well, let's sabotage it, let's disrupt it, let's destroy that, let's blow that up. America's not building anything. China and its allies are building things in Asia. Russia's building things in Asia. Americans and the British and the Europeans are just blowing things up. That's the difference.
Yeah, and that's gonna bounce back on us. I just have a very confident that that's not going to end well for us ultimately. Listen, in the time we got left here, I want to talk about something that's happening right now, but also something that you had called about 6 or 7 months ago in December of 2024, when there was a lot of issues going on with the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And I'm afraid I don't have the clip handy, but you said on our show that you thought this was just going to turn into a civil war and it's going to reignite it and all that kind of stuff. Well, it was kind of quiet for a while, and we said yay to the new guy who used to be known as al-Jilani, now is called al-Shara. And all of a sudden now here Israel has attacked again into another country, and they blew up their Ministry of Defense building and attacked the presidential palace in Damascus. And now here we have this a new conflict breaking out. And according to al-Shara, it is still very much like that. And so I got a couple of things to show from this. But first of all, I just kind of want your view on what this is happening here.
You are witnessing a very sophisticated theatrical performance. Okay, this is like geopolitical World Wrestling Federation of the highest level. The choreographed bit is between Israel and this regime in Syria. So just a few weeks ago, Jolani, the self-proclaimed president in Damascus, was basically saying, we want to normalize relations with Israel, and our real enemies are Hezbollah and Iran. So that was only a couple of weeks ago. And now, all of a sudden, this has happened. So this is America and its allies put Jolani into power. Israel put Jolani into power. They paved the way for HTS to take over and fly the black flag over Damascus. That's just a fact of history right now. Those who deny that, well, they're looking at a different picture. So now he gets into power, and you start seeing sectarian violence against Alawites in the coastal region, against Ismailis in the Midlands of Syria, against other groups. Yazidis and Christians have also been subject to this. And now the Druze in the southern corridor of Syria. And so they want to disarm the Druze. Well, who wants the Druze disarmed? Who else is occupying southern Syria? Israel is occupying the Golan Heights. So Israel's engineered devilishly cleverly, as is Washington's role in this, have engineered a situation where they've got Jolani to attack the Druze, okay, predictable reaction, okay, and then now the Israel's then cozying up to the Druze, saying, you need our protection. This is like a protection racket going on here. And then Israel makes a symbolic gesture of bombing Damascus and the presidential palace, Ministry of Defense. So that looks like, from the optical point of view, to the Druze, wow, look, the Israelis are on our side. They're hitting Sharar, al-Jilani, and he's now moved his troops back. So maybe Israel is our ally. Why? Why? Because Israel has been desperate to cut a corridor that connects the Golan Heights, which they occupy, so connecting Israel through the Golan Heights, through the Druze enclaves, to Al-Tanf, where the United States has had a base for a very long time now, right the way up along the Iraqi border to the Kurdish controlled area of Syria in the northeast. Okay, and that provides a bridge to Iraqi Kurdistan, and that is the path to Iran, and also into Iraq. So basically, you're looking at the potential. This is absolutely going to be a sectarian civil war that is being triggered right now, much more than before. And so Lebanon is also included in this as well. So you're looking at what the Americans and the Israelis are attempting to do is a new Sykes-Picot. They are attempting to redraw the lines of Syria, break it into 3, possibly 4 separate statelets. Lebanon as well, redrawing the borders of Lebanon, okay, and Iraq. Iraq is last, okay? So the destabilization of Iraq, and they want to basically cut off Iran from Lebanon. So there's no potential for any overland routes or any reconstitution of the axis of resistance. That's part of what this is about. The later stage plan of this David's Corridor, which is what many analysts are calling it. I don't know if the Israelis are calling it that, but the David Corridor, okay, is the Greater Israel Project. And so the U.S. is quite happy to go along with that long-term plan for Israel, so long as the U.S. gets what it wants and its allies get what they want geopolitically. So this is the symbiotic special relationship between Israel and the United States, and they're choreographing this to make it look like sectarian strife in Syria. And it's anything but. Israel caused the sectarian strife. The United States have caused the sectarian strife. They've encouraged Jolani. They said nothing. He was not reprimanded when he killed 1,000 Alawites in the coastal region, summary executions on the streets. And so of course, the Druze saw this and said, well, we don't want that to happen to us. We're arming up. And Jolani saw the fact that the West and Israel weren't doing anything about him massacring Alawites, so he said, we're going to move on to the Druze now. So you can see how this thing unfolded. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But I fear, as many do, that you're looking at the onset here of a very bloody sectarian war that could drag on for years and decimate Lebanon, Syria, and eventually they want to get their hooks into Iraq.
Okay, and man, we could do a whole show on this. I wish we had more time, but let me ask one more question, final question here. Given everything that you just said here, Iran, we had a show this week with Ted Postel on it, which he made the very strong case that thanks to the bombing of the Fordo site and the Natanz and the Isfahan that Trump did, that we now have become blinded and we no longer have any idea what what Iran is doing. And that now then, if they decide to go to a bomb, there's no way we'll know that. And that even according to NBC News yesterday, which we'll talk about in the show this afternoon, they're saying that now then evidence said that only one of the three sites was destroyed. The other two were damaged, but that they could be reprocessing even in those facilities within a few months. Ted Postel made the argument that if Iran was smart and knew that this attack was coming, they could have moved those centrifuges elsewhere and could immediately start reprocessing. And they already have apparently up over 400 grams of reprocessed material at 60%. And so now then they have everything they need to actually weaponize and mount on a missile nuclear weapons, up to 10 of them perhaps. Would the evolution of what you describe here everywhere else, would that cause Iran to say, hey, we're definitely going to be in the next in the crosshairs, and the only thing we can do is to have a nuclear weapon? How do you see that?
They have every reason to, or every motivation to, been given every signal to acquire a nuclear deterrent. Certainly preemptive, unprovoked attacks by Israel and the United States. You don't need any better reason than that. So, I mean, the problem is in the interim between them demonstrating that they have a weapon or the United States claiming they're about to test a weapon, there could be total annihilation against Iran by U.S. forces, by Israeli forces. So,
well, but in this scenario, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't have any idea until a bomb was presented, and now then we can't do that.
Yeah, but the U.S. and Israel can act before a bomb is presented at any time, which they've already demonstrated. So that's the paradox of this situation. So I personally think it's a very credible deterrent because Iran's already proven the real important part, which is missile accuracy and the capability to deploy missiles that are able to penetrate all sorts of integrated air defenses. So like they've already demonstrated their capabilities there. There's no reason to doubt their capabilities there. But the nuclear warhead, the armed nuclear warhead, of course, that's the big question there. I think, a lot of people, including Mearsheimer and others, saying they can't believe Iran didn't get a nuclear weapon a long time ago, and that's a huge mistake for them not to have done that. But then Iranians will argue otherwise, saying that they don't believe escalation in terms of nuclear armament is right. It's not halal. They've issued a fatwa against it as well. So there might be a societal aversion to taking that route from maybe an Islamic point of view or so forth. Who knows? But from a pure geopolitical point of view, they don't even, it's not even that they have a right to do it. They do have a right, especially now. But they're going to, they have to, it's almost like there's no choice because it's either get a deterrent or face total annihilation. That's one way to look at it. Certainly the realists are going to make that argument. So, personally, I think that, Iran, Israel was 2 weeks away from really collapse. If the Iranians had kept going for 2 more weeks, the political pressure inside of Israel would have just, I think, burst. They took a hiding the likes of that they've never seen before.
Yep.
So, and it was really a few more weeks of that. I think we saw when it stopped, Israel was at its breaking point socially, politically, and militarily. And the United States, they begged the U.S. to step in, begged them. And the U.S. bailed out Israel in that sense. Maybe this was part of the plan, who knows? But that's clearly how it went down. But does Iran want to face off against the United States again, or maybe even a more protracted conflict, or Israel, the U.S. deploying nukes preemptively? Definitely, the Iranians have to think about that calculus. That's a difficult one.
Yeah. There's no easy calls on any aspect of this, but the more we keep it ginned up with arms, ammunition, weapons, and doing stuff like what you're describing as you see it, what's happening with this issue in Syria, that ain't going to help it any. And we'll just have to wait and see how that transpires. But boy, really appreciate you coming on today. A great show, all the things you've talked about here and told us about what was happening. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danny.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that on the way out. Also, as a reminder, we are on podcast now, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcast. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you'll find us there. Also, this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about this Israeli issue that Patrick was just talking about here. And we'll go into a little bit more detail. That's at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. We'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.